Have you ever noticed how silence can be louder than words? Sometimes the most powerful thing an empath can do isn't to chase, explain, or overgive, it's to step back. And when that happens, something interesting stirs inside the avoidant who once thought they held all the power. That's silence. It makes them think and it makes them regret. We often imagine that an empath's strength lies only in their giving nature. But the truth is, when a super empath sets boundaries, that quiet shift creates a ripple effect. It unsettles the avoidant, who suddenly realizes they're losing something rare, something deeply human. When someone has been used to the steady presence of a super empath, the sudden absence of that energy doesn't feel small. It feels seismic. Empaths carry a natural ability to tune into the emotional frequency of another person, to listen beyond the words, to notice what's unspoken, and to fill in the gaps with patience and care. For an avoidant, this presence often becomes a hidden comfort. They may never admit it, but they rely on the empath's warmth to soften their own emotional edges. The empath is often the one initiating connection, checking in, making sure the relationship has rhythm and flow. And while the avoidant might shrug off those gestures or even act like they don't need them, that quiet consistency becomes part of the air they breathe. When the empath decides to go silent, that pattern breaks. The avoidant is suddenly faced with a kind of emptiness they didn't expect. It's like walking into a room where the light has always been on, only to find it dark for the first time. At first, they might brush it off, telling themselves it doesn't matter, that the distance is normal or even preferable. But human beings are wired to notice absence, especially when it's the absence of someone who once gave without hesitation. The empath's energy was not just attention, it was a form of grounding. It made the avoidant feel safer than they ever acknowledged. And without it, small cracks start to show. The absence of energy from the empath isn't just about fewer texts, less eye contact, or shorter conversations. It's the absence of emotional cushioning. Before, when the avoidant pulled away, the empath was there to lean in. When the avoidant hesitated to share, the empath created space for openness. When the avoidant needed reassurance but couldn't ask for it, the empath provided it anyway. Now that layer of emotional care is missing, and the avoidant has to sit in the rawness of their own distance. They feel it not just in their mind, but in their body, in the quiet moments when they reach for the comfort they didn't value and realize it's no longer there. There's also something deeply unsettling about the quiet confidence of an empath who pulls back. Unlike others who might beg for attention or chase after reassurance, the empath's silence carries a message. I don't need to convince you of my worth. I already know it. That message lands in the avoidant's psyche, whether they consciously recognize it or not. They sense that they're no longer being chased, no longer being held at the center of someone else's emotional world, and rather than feeling relief, it stirs discomfort. The avoidant begins to wonder if the connection they treated as optional is slipping out of reach. What makes this even more powerful is that the empath doesn't withdraw in anger or dramatics. They simply redirect their energy inward toward themselves. That calm detachment creates a contrast that the avoidant can't ignore. The avoidant may not run after them immediately, but the loss registers in subtle ways, in the way their thoughts drift back to the empath, in the way silence feels heavier than it used to, and in the way they start noticing just how much emotional space that empath used to hold. That absence becomes its own form of presence, louder than any words could ever be. When the super empath goes silent, one of the first things the avoidant begins to do, often without realizing it, is replay old conversations in their mind. Human memory is selective, and when someone important pulls away, our minds naturally search for evidence of what once was. The avoidant, who may have brushed off those meaningful exchanges in the moment, finds themselves revisiting them like a highlight reel. They recall the way the empath listened intently, the way their words were received without judgment, the subtle validation woven into every response. What once felt ordinary suddenly takes on weight because it is no longer there to lean on. This mental replay isn't always pleasant for the avoidant. It can stir both nostalgia and guilt. They might think back to a time when the empath offered encouragement during their lowest moments, or to a conversation where the empath's understanding made them feel seen in a way few others ever have. Those moments that seemed so small at the time begin to feel precious in hindsight. And with each replay, the avoidant begins to question why they didn't value it more when it was right in front of them. Silence has a way of amplifying memory, and in the absence of the empath's voice, those past words echo louder. The avoidant may also start to analyze details they once overlooked. They might recall the tone of warmth in the empath's voice, the way a simple, "I understand," carried more comfort than 1,000 explanations, or the way the empath gently redirected conflict without escalating it. These subtle patterns, once invisible, now stand out as unique. They compare those conversations with interactions they have with others and realize the contrast. Other people may not listen with the same depth, may not hold space with the same patience. Suddenly, what was taken for granted is reclassified as rare. In some cases, this mental replay can even lead to self-interrogation. The avoidant may remember moments where they shut down, dismissed, or pulled away while the empath reached out with compassion. They begin to see those instances differently, not as harmless habits, but as missed opportunities for closeness. This reflection can create an uncomfortable awareness. The empath gave them something valuable, and they pushed it aside. That kind of realization lingers, and it plants the seed of regret. There's also an element of longing that grows in these replays. The avoidant starts to miss the emotional safety net the empath provided. They miss the way they could share half a thought and the empath would understand the rest, or the way silence between them didn't feel cold but comforting. These small nuances replay again and again because they stand in stark contrast to the emptiness the avoidant feels now. Memory becomes both a comfort and a torment. Comfort because it brings back the warmth of connection, torment because it highlights the void that silence has created. What's fascinating here is that the empath doesn't have to remind them of any of this. The avoidant's own mind does the work. In their quiet moments, late at night, during a commute, or in the middle of an ordinary day, old conversations resurface uninvited, and with each recollection, the avoidant is nudged toward the truth they've tried to avoid. The empath's presence wasn't just nice, it was irreplaceable. When the super empath withdraws their energy, the avoidant is forced to sit with an uncomfortable contrast. For so long, the empath acted as the bridge, smoothing over the distance that the avoidant created. The empath's patience, warmth, and willingness to engage gave the relationship a sense of balance, even when the avoidant's instinct was to pull away. But once that energy is removed, the avoidant begins to see themselves reflected more clearly, and the reflection isn't always flattering. Without the empath cushioning the impact of their detachment, the avoidant is confronted with the coldness of their own behavior. The absence of softness makes their own walls stand out more starkly. This contrast can be startling because it highlights something the avoidant has tried to minimize the cost of their own emotional patterns. Before, when they created distance, the empath leaned in and filled the space, making sure connection wasn't lost. That made the avoidant's tendency to withdraw feel less damaging, almost invisible. Now, with the empath silent, every gap is exposed. The avoidant begins to feel the true weight of their own distance, and it isn't softened by the empath's presence. What was once hidden beneath a layer of care and effort is now laid bare, and it forces the avoidant to confront just how much they've relied on someone else to maintain intimacy. This realization can trigger an unsettling awareness of what they've pushed away. The empath's warmth is no longer a constant, and the avoidant starts to feel the chill of their own avoidance. They notice how different the connection feels now compared to when the empath's energy was there to balance things out. This stark difference stirs a sense of loss because they start to recognize that the empath's presence wasn't just pleasant, it fundamentally changed the dynamic of the relationship. Without it, the avoidant is left with a version of themselves that feels incomplete, unfulfilled, and harder to hide from. The contrast also exposes what they secretly wanted but couldn't admit. Deep down, many avoidants crave closeness just as much as anyone else, but their fear of vulnerability pushes them to act in the opposite direction. The empath, with their ability to nurture without demanding, gave them a taste of that closeness in a way that felt safe. When that's taken away, the avoidant feels the tension between what they thought they wanted, distance, and what they actually miss, connection. The empath's silence throws this inner conflict into sharp relief, and it becomes harder to deny. Over time, this contrast can create a quiet kind of regret that lingers. The avoidant starts to realize that their own actions, or lack of them, played a role in creating the very silence they now feel. The empath didn't abandon them, the empath simply stopped compensating for the imbalance. And in that moment of clarity, the avoidant can no longer ignore the fact that their distance cost them something precious. The contrast becomes a mirror, and in it, they see both what they lost and what they never fully allowed themselves to embrace. For the avoidant, control is often their silent companion. They may not consciously frame it that way, but much of their behavior is about maintaining emotional distance on their own terms. They decide when to lean in and when to pull back, when to give a little and when to disappear into themselves. This pattern gives them a sense of security because they believe they hold the upper hand. They never have to risk too much vulnerability. The super empath, with their natural tendency to give and understand, often plays into this rhythm without meaning to. They reach out when the avoidant withdraws, they smooth things over when tension arises, and they keep the connection alive even when it feels one-sided. All of this creates the illusion that the avoidant is in control of the emotional dynamic. But when the empath decides to stop overextending and goes silent, the power structure shifts in a way the avoidant doesn't expect. Suddenly, the usual push and pull dynamic no longer works. The avoidant pulls back, and this time, there's no one reaching in to close the gap. The space they create is met not with pursuit, but with calm detachment. That shift unsettles them because it reveals a truth they've worked hard to avoid. Their sense of control was never as solid as they believed. The empath was the one holding the thread of connection all along, and without their effort, the entire balance begins to collapse. This loss of control doesn't necessarily show up as dramatic panic. It often begins as subtle unease. The avoidant might notice that their usual behaviors aren't getting the same results. Where they once expected the empath to check in after a day of silence, there's nothing. Where they anticipated reassurance after withdrawing, there's only quiet. These small breaks in the pattern signal to the avoidant that something has changed, and it leaves them off balance. Their strategies for keeping emotional distance no longer feel protective. They start to feel isolating. There's also a deeper layer of discomfort here. Without the empath stepping in to bridge the emotional gap, the avoidant realizes they are not the one dictating the pace anymore. The silence becomes a quiet declaration of independence, a way of saying, I'm not waiting for you to decide how this relationship unfolds. That kind of boundary, delivered not through anger, but through absence, challenges the avoidant's sense of control more powerfully than confrontation ever could. It leaves them wondering if they've underestimated the empath's strength, if the connection they assumed would always be there is now slipping away beyond their influence. As this awareness grows, the avoidant may begin to feel a creeping regret. The very control they once clung to starts to feel like the thing that cost them stability. By holding back, by keeping distance, they created a situation where the empath had no choice but to step away. And now, in the silence, they sense their grip loosening in ways they can't reverse. What was once a game of managing closeness becomes a realization that they've lost something they never thought could be taken from them. One of the most powerful realizations that begins to surface for the avoidant when the super empath goes silent is the possibility of being replaced. For so long, they've operated under the assumption that the empath's love, attention, and patience were constants. The empath was always there to reach out, to forgive, to wait, to understand. That reliability created a subconscious sense of security in the avoidant. No matter how much they withdrew, no matter how inconsistent they were, the empath's heart would remain available. But when the empath finally steps back, the avoidant is confronted with a new and unsettling reality. What if that love no longer belongs to them alone? What if someone else receives it? The avoidant begins to notice that silence is not just absence, it creates space. And in that space, they imagine the empath directing their warmth, attention, and energy elsewhere. This thought can sting deeply, even for someone who once seemed indifferent to connection. They may not have admitted it, but part of the comfort they drew from the empath was the unspoken belief that you were uniquely chosen to receive that depth of care, to picture another person being on the receiving end of that attentiveness. Someone else laughing at those same jokes, being soothed by those same words, or feeling understood in that same profound way creates an H that is difficult to ignore. What intensifies this feeling is the avoidant's awareness of how rare the empath's qualities are. They know, even if they've never said it, that most people do not listen the way the empath listens, do not love with the same generosity, do not offer patience with the same consistency. To see the empath's silence is to recognize that those gifts are no longer being directed at them, and the idea that another person could be experiencing that instead triggers a sharp sense of loss. The avoidant begins to replay what it felt like to be on the receiving end of that love and realizes that they cannot easily replace it, no matter how hard they might try to convince themselves otherwise. This possibility of being replaced also challenges the avoidant's sense of importance. Part of their avoidance often comes from the belief that they can keep distance without losing connection, that the empath will always wait, always forgive, always adjust. But when the silence stretches on, that belief cracks. The avoidant begins to see that they are not indispensable, that the empath has the freedom to choose differently, and that their place in the empath's life is not guaranteed. This recognition can be jarring because it strips away the illusion of control and exposes a vulnerability the avoidant has worked hard to bury. The fear of being replaced is not just about jealousy, it's about the realization that they squandered something precious. It is about the dawning awareness that someone else could now be appreciating the very qualities they overlooked. In that recognition lies regret for taking the empath for granted, regret for assuming love would stay no matter what, regret for failing to nurture the connection when they had the chance. And it's in this quiet but piercing awareness that the avoidant begins to feel the true cost of their distance. When a super empath chooses silence, it isn't about punishment, it's about self-respect. That quiet shift has the power to make the avoidant reflect in ways they never imagined. They begin to notice the absence, they replay the memories, they feel the contrast, they sense control slipping, and they start to imagine what it would mean to lose something irreplaceable. Regret doesn't always come in loud declarations. Sometimes it shows up in the quiet moments of realization, when the truth can no longer be ignored. The beauty of the empath's silence is that it speaks louder than words ever could. It says, I know my worth. I don't have to chase. I don't have to beg. My love is a gift. And if it's not received, I'll take it where it will be valued. That's the moment the avoidant begins to regret. And that's the moment the empath steps fully into their own power. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for giving your energy to this space today. If this message resonated with you, carry it forward as a reminder. Sometimes silence isn't emptiness, it's strength. And sometimes the greatest lesson you can give someone is the one you never have to say out loud. Goodbye for now, and thank you